I can see there's a few people joining, so we might just wait a few minutes until others have joined. All right, well, we might just get started then. So, good evening and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be sharing with you tonight some high-level insights from our first of its kind research into the changing face of clinical careers. Let me first introduce you to my co-hosts and introduce myself as well. My name's Claire Ponsford. I'm the owner and director of Wavelength International, and we're a medical recruitment company focusing on permanent and locum recruitment services to hospitals and practices in Australia and New Zealand. And I have a background in healthcare within the health service in the UK and also in Australia in medical HR, medical workforce planning, and also postgraduate medical education. And then we have Wayne Bruce, and Wayne is the founder and director of Ccentric Group. Prior to Ccentric, Wayne worked in healthcare management within the rehab services sector in Victoria, and then moved into executive search with Lincroft Consulting. He started Ccentric back in 2001. Welcome, Wayne.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
And then we have Dr. Amandeep Hansra, who's a general practitioner and a leader in digital health in Australia. Amandeep, for me, epitomizes the changing face of clinical careers, I guess, in terms of the career choices that she's made since qualifying as a GP. She's worked as a senior medical advisor for Medibank. She's been the chief medical officer of Telstra Health. She's on the board of a number of healthcare related businesses, and also provides consulting services on digital health to hospitals, businesses, startups, etc. She founded the Creative Careers in Medicine community back in 2017 to really provide support to like-minded professionals who were considering what their career options were. And she also has time to practice clinically as a GP. Not quite sure where she finds that time, but anyway, welcome, Amandeep.
Thanks, Claire.
Now, let me just take you through a little bit of housekeeping. We are wanting to make this webinar as interactive as possible, and we will be taking questions, which we'll answer at the end. For those of you not familiar with Zoom, there's a toolbar, Zoom toolbar, that you'll see a Q&A icon. And if you click on that icon, you'll be able to type in questions really at any time during the webinar, and we'll collate those and answer them towards the end. We'll also be running a series of polls, which we encourage you to participate in. We're expecting, I guess, to be online for perhaps about an hour, and depending on how long we take for Q&A. So let me just quickly skip you through our agenda and what we'll be covering this evening. We'll be looking at the background as to why we felt it was important to conduct this research. Our aims of the research, we'll be reviewing some of the key findings and trying to understand what factors contribute to a clinician's decision to pursue a divergent career in medicine. And I think Amandeep will have some great insights there and anecdotes in terms of her own experience and those of the clinicians in the Creative Careers in Medicine community. We'll then be discussing what options are available outside of traditional clinical work, and considering some of the stakeholders in terms of healthcare employers, colleges, etc. And we'll also be looking at salary expectations, and this is something that Wayne will be commenting on and giving us some information on. And finally, in this era of COVID, we will be examining whether the pandemic has actually accelerated change in terms of clinicians' views on whether they should be looking at divergent or alternative careers, and then of course having time for questions at the end. So in terms of an overview of why we decided to embark on this research and white paper, I guess we all know that healthcare globally and in Australia is changing, and there are numerous factors that contribute to this, including the ageing population, increasingly complex models of care, advances in technology, consumer expectations, and the pressures of financial sustainability. The impact of these changes on the existing healthcare workforce is significant, and we have to remember that the healthcare sector is the biggest growing sector in Australia in terms of workforce. But healthcare organisations will need to manage the transition of current employees to potentially new and different ways of working in the future. The healthcare workforce of the future will require its professionals to work increasingly in multidisciplinary teams, and our healthcare systems will have to balance the benefits of technology and AI alongside a need for that sort of face-to-face and human touch. Anecdotally, CCAM, Wavelength and Ccentric were hearing directly from clinicians about feelings of burnout, perhaps mental health and wellbeing issues, and also some dissatisfaction with traditional career paths. With this backdrop in mind, Wavelength, Ccentric and CCAM collaborated to undertake a survey of clinicians and to try and understand their views on their career options and their interests and motivations regarding non-traditional clinical roles. So what were the aims of our research? Well, as I said, we were keen to uncover clinicians' interests and motivations, and also understand whether there was a gap between those interests and motivations and the expertise levels. We were also keen to uncover what factors were at play in the desire to pursue something different to that traditional patient-facing role. So for instance, was it a push factor of burnout and dissatisfaction, or the pull factor of perhaps wanting to make a broader difference to healthcare outcomes, as opposed to just that one-on-one patient interaction? We felt that our research and subsequent white paper would help raise awareness amongst stakeholders such as healthcare employers and medical schools and colleges of what support clinicians are seeking in order to be fulfilled and engaged members of the healthcare workforce of the future. We also felt it important to explore whether there was a gap between the interests and the expertise level. As I mentioned, as I guess that potentially highlights an urgent requirement for reform of undergraduate and postgraduate clinical training and education. So before I launch into the key findings, just to give you a little bit of extra background on how we created the white paper, we conducted a survey of 857 clinical professionals Australia-wide, and we conducted that between November 2019 and April 2020. We also sought the views of some high-profile leaders in healthcare in Australia, as well as tapping into existing global and national research about medical workforce and the future of healthcare. So I'll just take you through some of the initial data. So from our 857 clinicians that completed the survey, you can just see the breakdown there in terms of the various professions that they occupied. And our largest cohort of respondents was within the medical leader and specialist space, as well as general practitioner, followed closely by that middle grade doctor side of things and junior doctors, but I guess also a fairly good representation from nursing, lower from directors of medical services and allied health, but you know, we do have some good insights into their views as well. And then from the perspective of current clinical practice, you'll see on that graph as well that the vast majority were at the time of completing the survey still practicing clinically. Slightly different for the nursing and allied health cohorts. Fewer of them practicing clinically. That may well be because I think that cohort largely had respondents that had already moved out of clinical practice into management. So if we take a deeper look at the clinical expertise side of things, you'll see that from a specialty perspective, general practice and emergency medicine were represented most highly, but there was really a fair smattering of survey respondents in all of the major specialty areas as well. And it was interesting for us to understand whether or not there were any variances in terms of the views of the respondents in each of these specialty areas. And then if we move on to some of the interests of the survey participants, they told us of those divergent, non-traditional career interests that they had, and they ranged from digital health through to clinical research, public health, etc. And I should point out here that in terms of the categories, we have combined under digital health things like AI, machine learning, health informatics, etc. And the same with communication. We've included medical writing and health journalism, and the industry category includes pharmaceuticals and biomedical engineering. And just to delve a little deeper, we did note some differences in terms of people's views and expertise in some of these areas. So for instance, we found that our GP survey respondents had a high level of interest in divergent career options, but their self-identified expertise was very low and perhaps the lowest of all of the cohorts. Our middle grade doctor respondents showed the highest interest in the combined digital health category, and our junior doctors also expressed an interest in digital health, but public health ranked quite highly, and this perhaps reflects an increased awareness of prevention rather than treatment in the healthcare strategies and priorities now and into the future. So I'd like to now hand over to Amandeep, who will give us a bit more insight into those interest areas and the key drivers and inspirations for those clinical professionals in seeking a divergent career path. Amandeep?
Thanks, Claire, for that. And good evening, everybody, and thank you for attending. I think this, as Claire mentioned, this research was really quite interesting for us. I mean, we have to take into consideration that some of the participants, you know, self-selected. They were people who either were part of the creative careers in medicine community who had already kind of identified that they were interested in looking at non-traditional career options, and also some of the people that might have responded from Wavelength or Ccentric who were also, you know, out there looking for career opportunities. So taking that with a grain of salt, I mean, it's still interesting, the findings. So when we looked at some of the questions, you know, we sort of delved a little bit further into, you know, the skill areas that people sort of nominated that they thought they had, as well as, you know, where they wanted to go with their career and what sort of inspirations they had in terms of actual interest areas. And it was interesting because we were trying to look at, you know, as Claire had mentioned, people identifying that they had expertise in a certain area, but an interest potentially in another area, and whether those sorts of things matched up. But overall, we found that, you know, it was about almost 3/4 of the health professionals surveyed were looking at non-traditional career opportunities. What that actually means, and it might mean different things to different people, but, you know, that we weren't sort of just kind of specifically focusing on non-clinical. It was just things that people didn't classify as, you know, being a traditional GP full-time in a clinical setting or a a hospital doctor in a full-time specialty. It was doing anything outside of that. And you'll see some of the areas that Claire mentioned, you know, they're not all considered non-clinical, but they are considered, you know, probably not the straight sort of conventional medical careers. And then there were about 60% of people who said that they had qualifications or experiences to support their sort of non-traditional clinical roles. And again, as Claire mentioned, some of those, many of those, you know, they were spread out across the different groups, but as a GPs that, you know, may have not identified some of the skill sets that they had. And, you know, that it's interesting because there's sort of 60% who are identifying that they have those other non-traditional skill sets, but, you know, I'm pretty sure it would be 100% of those GPs and other healthcare professionals, if we actually looked at what they had skills in, would have expertise in things outside of clinical care. It's just things that we're not used to identifying or qualifying. So, you know, they may well have leadership skills because they've run a practice or they've worked in a resus situation and run, you know, a clinical scenario, but they don't identify that as leadership skills. And I think that goes back to the inherent sort of issue that doctors have where everything has to, you know, in terms of training and skills and expertise, it kind of has to be something formal for them. They have to have done a course in it or a fellowship. That's sort of how we're trained. Whereas a lot of people outside of medicine, they count on the job experience in a certain area as, you know, giving them qualifications to say, I'm an expert in leadership or in governance. Whereas for doctors, we tend to want that piece of paper and that, you know, those letters after our name to say, yes, we've identified that we have those skills. We also looked at whether, you know, people wanted to have a full move over from, you know, having a full-time clinical career into, you know, something a little bit non-traditional. And there were only sort of 18% of people who said they would go full-time into something new. 51% of people sort of were opting for part-time casual sort of contract work in non-traditional roles, which again shows that I think people want that variety. They're happy to hold on to sort of their traditional clinical role, and as I have done in my life, holding on to my general practice, but being able to do some things with your other days in the week is really appealing for people. And we think that's probably the driver. The other driver might be that people want to test things out and say, well, would I actually enjoy it on the other side? I think that I'm going to enjoy non-traditional careers, but would I enjoy teaching? Would I enjoy research? Would I enjoy working in health technology? So, yeah, there might be some other drivers. We didn't sort of go into those, but most people really want to do it just as a casual or a contract sort of opportunity. So we're just going to move over to the next slide. So these are sort of breaking down the top areas of expertise and interest. And as I mentioned before, people might have an interest in an area, but then they may not identify that they have any experience or expertise in that specific sort of career option. And so if we have a look at digital health, which as Claire mentioned, we grouped it together, was actually the largest area of people having interest. But then only 15% felt like they had expertise in that area. And again, you know, you don't know how much of that is identified expertise. You know, they might be using patient management systems or EMRs in the hospital, but they don't count that as expertise. And so, you know, for us, that sort of says, well, there's a gap there in terms of upskilling these people in these areas that they're interested in, but there may not be lots of sort of courses or qualifications available for people to feel like they've gained that sort of tick of approval. But the most common single area of interest and not grouped was medical education and coaching. We didn't go into enough detail to work out whether this was, you know, what the interpretations of this were people sort of saying education was about their own continuous professional development. Was it about teaching other people? Was it coaching their peers or coaching patients? But I think it's something that probably does need to be explored because it's such a large area of interest. And we actually do have a lot of people who feel like they have expertise in medical education, with 24% identifying. And I guess the other areas that we're seeing in this as well is the health management, administration, policy and governance, and public health too, which I think is fascinating because this was actually done pre-COVID, and we'll talk a little bit about COVID sort of changes. So already people were identifying that public health was something of interest. And I remember talking to a lot of people at CCIM who were saying, I really want to get involved in public health. And we had some speakers at previous conferences on public health, and sort of the resounding message was there's not a lot of jobs in public health. You know, like we're all having to be a bit creative in what we end up doing with our public health qualification. So if you want to come and do a public health fellowship, just be prepared that there may not be a full-time role for you at the end. Gosh, how times have changed, and we can't get enough public health people now. So I'm all for, you know, those people that have identified in this survey, the 26% of people saying they want to do public health. I think we absolutely should be encouraging them. And so we'll just move on to the next slide. And what we're actually going to do is a poll here now. And just sort of, you know, I guess confirm our research findings, and just get people to poll, answer the poll for us. In which area outside of clinical work do you have the most interest in? And we've got digital health, medical education and coaching, health management, health policy and governance, public health, and if anything's not there, you can tick the other box. So we'll just give you 20 more seconds to answer that one. And I think we're probably going to find that even the people who've attended tonight are probably going to be quite aligned with what we found in the survey. Okay, and okay, I think we might have, is there any other stragglers you want to poll? Otherwise we're going to end that. And so what we have is we have medical education and coaching coming out on top at 38%, digital health second at 27%, 25% of people said other, 21%, very similar to our survey findings in public health, and health management and policy and governance at 21% and 16%. So I think we can sort of confidently say that probably have a representative group here tonight who are reflecting that those survey results were probably fairly accurate. So we're just going to move on to the next slide. And what we want to talk about here, just bear with me so I can get my slides back up. So when we actually looked at why people were having an interest in these non-traditional careers, and I think as Claire had mentioned earlier that, you know, was it the push factor or was it the pull factor? And when we asked people, you know, what were sort of the factors that led them to this interest, the three sort of top reasons for their interest was variety. So 17% of people said they wanted variety, 14% said they wanted flexibility, and 12% said it was for an interest or passion. And so I find it interesting that the top two reasons, variety and flexibility, are things that people feel like, you know, they potentially can't get in their normal traditional clinical career, and they're looking outside, you know, for some other career that might offer them those two reasons. The interest and the passion, I mean, that's sort of what we think is the, you know, the pull factor, where people are actually interested in technology or interested in governance or management. But I think the variety and flexibility is really something that we should take on board for, you know, trying to address some of the issues in our clinical careers. Like, are we giving people flexible options, you know, if they're wanting to work in a hospital setting, working in general practice or in any other clinical role, that, you know, they are able to have the flexibility, so they're not having to think, I have to actually leave a traditional clinical role to get the flexibility I need to have my work-life balance or to have the other things that interest me. And variety, I think, again, you know, in a clinical role, you know, for people who employ doctors in hospital settings, is there a way that you can mix up what they do in that setting? You know, be involved in an EMR project in the hospital, be involved in some continuous improvement or quality assurance activities, and then do some clinical work. So I think there's some lessons back for the traditional clinical roles and those employers that employ people. If you ask people what are their inspirations for working in a clinical career, people said patient care, making a difference, and their colleagues. So 23% of people, you know, it was about patient care, and 20% of people said it was making a difference and having that collegiate sort of team-based, and their colleagues, 14% of people said that that was an inspiration. So I think there are still, you know, a lot of the drivers, you know, for remaining in clinical work that, you know, makes sense for why people got into healthcare. And you can see that in the previous sort of stats that we talked about, how many people wanted to only do a non-traditional career part of the time because they still felt, you know, that pull towards doing that patient care and making a difference and seeing patients. So I think it's important for us to understand those factors that drive people so that, you know, we are giving people the maximum potential benefit of, you know, doing their clinical work and feeling supported with variety and flexibility, but that we are recognising that, you know, some of them have an interest and passion outside and that can be supported as well. So I think, you know, one of the things that's happened since we did this survey, as I mentioned, you know, was that whole COVID response. And I will touch on it a little bit later, but we've certainly, even prior to that and leading up to COVID and then during COVID, had sort of an influx of clinicians wanting to upskill themselves in things outside of, you know, the traditional roles. And when we look at the reasons for some of that, and I think what we've noticed is that our medical graduates are changing. So if we have a look at the people that are coming out of medical school now, they're often older. So the average age of a medical student is 24 now. They've usually done a degree beforehand. So we've got a lot of postgraduate students and a lot of students who've actually worked in other roles before in other sectors. And these are the people who are looking to try and combine their previous experiences with healthcare. So I think that's something to keep in consideration when moving forward, that we are actually dealing with a whole new group of medical graduates who potentially don't want what previous groups have wanted. So I will move on now because I think we've got a lot to talk about, and I think I'm going to hand over to Wayne. Are you there, Wayne?
I am, and Amandeep. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I was just reflecting while Amandeep was talking that we had planned pre-COVID to launch this research with a series of breakfasts around the country. So some of you might be happy that you can do it from your office and lounge room without travel, and some of you might be missing out on what might have been a nice meal. But anyway, that's COVID for you. So if we look at the work type preferences, we found that with the exception of people in the nursing, midwifery and allied health group, there was a strong preference for part-time or contract or casual roles. Only 18% of people wanted a full-time option, which is not insignificant. But the fact that over 50% of people preferred something that was part-time or contract or casual would seem to indicate that most people, as Amandeep reflected, you know, they want to continue with whatever their existing clinical work is, but they want to combine it with an alternative option. Additionally, 32% of the people said they'd be happy to work remotely. Perhaps this reflects for some a desire for more work-life balance. You would certainly think that this percentage will have increased since COVID, you know, due to increased safety concerns for themselves and their patients and the rapid expansion of telehealth and so on. And of the people we surveyed, as you would expect, 3/4 said they would like to know about such opportunities when they came up. In terms of the remuneration expectations, as you can see there, it's sort of the bulk of people were in 4 groupings. So 13% in 100 to 150 per hour, or up to 247,000 if you annualize it. 15% in 150 to 200, or up to 346,000. 16% in the 2 to 300 range, or 494 annually, and 15% in the 300 to 500 per hour range, which maxes out at 692,000 per annum. So we'll now have a second poll for the night. We'll conduct a poll to ask your expectations around remuneration. The question is, would you expect to earn the same wage if you were taking up a divergent clinical career opportunity? And as you can see, the options are yes, no, rather not say, or other. We'll give you close to a minute to respond, and then look at the results of that. think I just saw Louise Schaefer put a little note up about the breakfast. I'm not sure if you said you were glad you weren't having it or you did want it, Louise, but anyway, we can catch up another day about that. All right, I think everyone's probably answered by now, so if we could look at the results. Okay. 59% of people said they would expect the same. 37 said no. Perhaps with that question, we could have also asked no, as in you would be happy to earn less, or no, as in you would want to earn more. So perhaps for future reparations of this, we'll look into that. And so that's it. So that's interesting. So if we perhaps just go back to that previous slide for a moment, and if you look at those expectations, it was quite, they were quite high. You know, over 30% of people were looking to sort of earn 350,000 and above, which is quite high. I would argue that if people genuinely want to pursue these options for reasons other than money, you probably need to have some flexibility around that, and you know, evaluate how much you're willing to forego, or if you need to forego some earnings in order to gain new skills and so on. But basically, working full time, these are obviously generalizations, but they're, you know, pretty close to the mark. Non-specialist doctors working in hospitals are, you know, usually earning between 200,000 and 250,000 per annum. GPs are earning around somewhere between 250 and 350 on average. Specialists would be on a package of typically 350 to 450,000, depending on the relevant state award. As you know, they vary greatly around the country. And then, of course, if they're doing private practice and particularly procedural work, you know, surgeons and people like that would be earning well over 500,000. So I think what we find is that a lot of people going into these CXIO roles, like a CMIO or a CNMIO, they are practicing clinicians or leaders, and they have an interest in, for example, digital health or medical admin and so on and so forth. I mean, most DMSs in private hospitals, it's very rare you find a full-time person as you would in a public hospital. They're usually a medical director of one of the specialties, and then they do the medical admin side a couple of days a week because they can contribute and they enjoy it. So yeah, as I say, I think people might need to look at their salary expectations if they're at that higher end of the expectation. And the more, you know, someone moves away from their traditional areas of clinical expertise, it's likely that they won't be paid as much of a premium for that training and expertise they have. So yeah, I think you just need to look at what is the employer's capacity to pay and where is the market sitting. I mean, working in executive recruitment, just in the healthcare side, and we've had a digital practice for a few years now, you know, we do have a good feel for what different roles do pay in the market. So I think, you know, you've got to just balance it with, are you looking to develop your skills, do interesting work, as Amandeep said, perhaps, you know, with a medium to longer term view, looking to broaden your skill base so that you're more marketable into the future. We've also conducted research with healthcare executives and clinicians that has actually shown us now through 2 iterations of similar research that the main motivating factors for people to either take up a new role with a different company or to stay with the company where they are. Why do they do that? Why do they choose to stay, or why do they choose to leave? And the major motivators around that relate to characteristics relative to the employer and characteristics relating to the job itself. So the themes we found in terms of employer characteristics were things such as the career opportunities they can offer. The organisation's reputation is very important. if you're going, well, particularly if you're going into an executive role, but overall, the quality of the leadership team. Certainly very important is culture and purpose of the organisation, and the ability it has to offer people the opportunities to innovate. Things relating to the job itself were professional development and a challenging role and the ability to make a difference. We've found consistency through our research that challenging role, sense of purpose, and ability to make a difference come through as almost always as the top three motivators. And remuneration was ranked fourth as the most important job-related role for only 16% of people. So I'd argue that remuneration isn't really a significant motivator in itself, as long as the money on offer is competitive in the market for the particular job. It's really more of a hygiene factor or a potential dissatisfier rather than a motivator. The other thing for clinicians moving into perhaps a more corporate style role or moving from the public hospital sector to something in the private sector is the elements of the salary package are very likely to change. In the public sector, it's quite rare to have performance bonuses, and there's no such thing as a long-term incentive or an equity plan that I'm aware of. But if you're moving into perhaps a more corporate style role, then your package will be a base salary and super, but then you'll have typically quite large components of what you might call an annual bonus or a short-term incentive. And a long-term incentive, or it might be called an equity plan or a share scheme or something like that if the company's publicly listed. And you'd usually think that they're coming in around 20 to 30% both both of those components. So there is opportunity to earn more subject to performance, but of course there's also the opportunity to earn less if you or the organisation don't hit the sort of targets that are tied to that. So moving on just to stakeholders that have been could be impacted by people. This is obviously intention survey. So if people do actually go through and enact their preferences, then there's going to be potentially some significant shifts. So I think for healthcare employers, certainly highlights the need for greater flexibility in scoping out their job roles, and as Amandeep said, giving people opportunity to take on alternative responsibilities in digital, in medical admin, public health, whatever it might be. I think for healthcare employers, understanding some of these motivations gives them a better understanding of what people are wanting to do. So therefore, it can help with forward clinical workforce planning and help employers to design roles that accommodate these alternative or divergent interests. And some proactive employers can also use the information to look at internal and external talent identification, succession planning, and some targeted education coaching and things like that. For healthcare workforce educators, obviously it highlights the need to expand their curricula to incorporate non-clinical topics. I'm certainly aware of many not many, but certainly some, an increasing number of universities now are embedding a core subject such as digital health in what would be called, or a department of digital health, or a school of digital health inside a medical sciences sort of school, where it sits beside concepts or subjects such as anatomy and physiology and things like that. So they're certainly moving on. Healthcare professional societies, obviously the importance of ongoing support for people's pathway to help them develop their skills and better equip themselves to pursue these non-clinical alternative options. For example, I do know that the Australian Institute of Digital Health, amongst a whole range of different agencies, but is looking to play a increasing part in providing courses for people to develop that. The issue is that most employers, they tend not to be that patient. Particularly if they bring someone in from outside the organisation, they tend to want people that are sort of job ready and able to be close to fully productive from day one. So the more that you can, gain the skills you need, then the more able you will be to get those sort of opportunities, I think. So that's really the implication for clinicians is, look at where you want to go from a medium to long-term career perspective, and then try and find out what are the job opportunities, what are the skills and experiences you need to be able to take those on, and plan out your professional development accordingly. So with that, I'll now hand back to Amandeep to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID.
Thanks, Wayne. So as we mentioned a few times tonight, we did this survey pre-COVID, and I think things have changed. Most of my information is anecdotal, though, based on conversations I've had and things I've been watching happen, particularly in the creative careers in medicine community. And so I sort of bucket these into a few different areas as to the impact of COVID. So I think one of them, a big one, is really the impact that COVID itself has had on healthcare professionals. There have been numerous cases we've heard of people getting quite burnt out. We've been working incredibly hard, particularly our colleagues in Melbourne and in other hotspot areas who have been sort of on edge for quite some time without sort of an end in sight. And I think it does wear people down, and they start to look at other options. I think people are exhausted. I think people are afraid. I think being on the front line certainly is confronting for a lot of healthcare providers. And I think for them, starting to sort of question, is this really what I want to do? Do I want to be full-time, patient care? So I think that part of COVID has certainly led to some people going, you know what, I really need a break from clinical care, and I want to look at what else I can do with my skills. I think part of that tied into that is also this reflection people are having on, life is short, sort of carpe diem, what all these things I've thought about doing all my life, and suddenly we're confronted with something that potentially impact our lives significantly. I've always had an interest in something else outside of, my sort of clinical career, and, how do I bring that into my everyday world? And, part of that has also been people spending more time with their family, being stuck at home, not being able to travel and do things like that, where they start to reprioritize what's important to them and try and find that work-life balance, trying, to meet all of the aspirations and interests that they've had their whole life. So I think there's that element of it. And then the other part of COVID, which is interesting, which is really the opportunities that have arisen out of this. Many industries have been impacted, very negatively by COVID. And I think healthcare in some ways, has been impacted in a positive way. And I say this, obviously not with a wish for COVID to be around, but, we've seen things like public health suddenly become a very important part of healthcare. Public health physicians have suddenly come into the limelight. I can now reel off names of public health physicians in Australia, whereas before I didn't really know any. And I think we've started to see them in the media. And this is another part that's really started to become obvious, that clinicians are also needed to front the media. They're needed to make sure that they're transmitting, communicating information that's scientific, that's evidence-based. And I've never seen so many doctors in the media as I've seen in the last few months. And talking to somebody who trains doctors in how to front media, she's been really busy in doing a lot of training for doctors, because suddenly we've needed all these people to be talking to reporters, going on radio, going on, the ABC. And I think that also has shone a light on this opportunity of doctors going into that sort of role of being communicators to the public and being able to disseminate credible information. The other thing that has come about is sort of, more of the management side, governance. We've needed a lot of doctors in sort of coordination roles, managing things like contact tracing, being parts of public health units, maybe not being public health physicians, but certainly augmenting a team. And I think that again has shown that, there's roles outside of direct patient care that doctors play an important role in. And this has been sort of leveraged during this whole pandemic. And then obviously we've had the major growth and shift in digital health, which, you know, I'm biased, but I find that the most exciting thing to see the innovation that has happened as we've transitioned to virtual delivery of healthcare, supporting digital health innovations like electronic prescribing, getting doctors, you know, up and ready with telehealth platforms, using apps to monitor patients with COVID, having ICUs be run by telehealth. I mean, there's been some incredible things that have happened, and this rapid development has meant that we have needed clinicians in those spaces, even finding clinicians who perhaps don't have expertise and experience in digital health, suddenly being able to come in and play a part in there. So for those people who are starting to look at how do I get my foot in the door, how do I get that first role, and as Wayne said, often in the past, you know, organisations have only wanted to hire doctors who are ready from day one with, you know, whatever other role that they've hired them for. I think now is an opportunity where the need is so great to get some of those early roles where you put your hand up and say, look, I'm willing to learn, I'm willing to do whatever it takes, you know, to help support this project. And so I think the opportunities that have come out of COVID, definitely for me, you know, sort of outweigh some of the negative things, but I do think that there's been, you know, sort of an effect both ways. And then I'm talking purely in a career sense, medical career sense, not saying there's anything really positive about COVID. But I do feel like we've shifted, and it's global. It's a global shift. I mean, I posted up an opportunity last night to try and find a Russian-speaking doctor who might, you know, have some public health experience and be interested in a digital health project in Central Asia. I mean, like, some of the opportunities that are coming up because of COVID are quite incredible. And there's a great quote from Louise Schaper, who I think is here this evening as well, who's the CEO of the Australasian Institute of Digital Health. And I think what the Institute has had to do over the last few months has, you know, really put them at the forefront of digital health. And that wouldn't have really happened with, you know, pre-pandemic. We were moving very slowly. So I think for me, we just might move on to the next slide. I think for me, before I wrap up, we'll probably do another poll. So just want to find out whether the people in this group who are here tonight have felt that COVID has changed their view of the future career trajectory, or has it been the same as it always has been? And COVID is just, you know, an annoying thing in the way, but have people really felt the last few months has made them change what they think they want to do with the rest of their lives? Give you another 20 seconds, I think. So I think for me personally, just I think I don't know if it's changed my view of my future career trajectory, but it's just confirmed it, that I was in the right spot to begin with. I questioned it before. Sometimes when people say, you do what? And now I go, okay, that was a reason I do what I do. And so for me, it's definitely confirmed where I am. And I think obviously 49%, nearly half of you agree that COVID has changed your view of the future career trajectory. 33% say no, that's okay. And 16% are unsure. So I think, you know, there'll be impacts, and we're not at the end of it yet. So we still don't know what's going to happen in 6 months from now. If they decide to get rid of telehealth and all the digital health stuff, I might have to question my future career trajectory, but hopefully not. So with that, what I might do is just hand back to Claire. I'll just get you back on.
Thanks, Amandeep. So that's the end of our formal presentation, and we've got about 10 minutes now for questions. And I've noted that some of you have been madly typing away with questions as we've been going through, and some of them have been answered by our staff who are working behind the scenes, but there are still some here needing a response. So this one might be for for you, Wayne, possibly. Can you give some examples of remuneration, salary expectations for non-clinical roles at the middle management level in the corporate world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I could give some off the top of my head. They won't necessarily be exact, but yeah, quite a lot of people over the years have moved into, you know, pharmaceuticals and worked in as medical advisors or medical MSLs, they call them, medical sales liaison officers, and so on and so forth. So it varies from the role, obviously, but if you were talking middle management, you're probably in a sort of a 2 to 250 range. In some of those medical advisor type roles, people with a background in sometimes general practice, sometimes specialists. Specialists tend to be less so because they tend to be a bit more expensive. So my experience is with pharmaceutical and medical device companies is they don't appoint specialist doctors full-time as much. And there's two reasons for that. One is that the specialists themselves don't want to become de-skilled in terms of their clinical work. So they're happy to be a medical advisor, you know, on a nephrologist providing advice on, you know, things related to them, to a Baxter or a Fresenius or someone like that, and they work a couple of days a week, and simply one of affordability. The employers can't pay that much. So I think there's a lot of scope, and it's really good to have done this research and understand, because I think on the digital side, you know, obviously there's some chief digital health officers, which are not necessarily CIO related now. They've moved more towards sort of the strategic level, and you don't necessarily have to have that really deep techie background. You know, they pay between 300 to 400. Typically, it'll vary. You'll get some that are more if it's a really big organization, but most of those roles are in that sort of range. Yeah, so, but I think there's lots of opportunities for people that are interested in data analytics and so on. I mean, one of the big benefits of everyone knows of EMRs and so on is that we're now collecting lots and lots of data, and as that data accumulates, we'll be able to look at you know, things that affect patient outcomes, such as the hospital where an operation or care took place, the doctor that actually performed it, and the model of care, you know, a whole range of treatment modalities. And as you get lots and lots of data, you can start to actually draw some valid inferences on what's, you know, statistically valid and reliable and so on. And so I think there is a big need with people I talk to that they are very keen to have people with a clinical frame be able to interpret some of that data from a clinical lens. And again, that's not necessarily full-time. It might be a couple of days a week, you know, and they're probably going to be paying, you know, around the 200 mark, maybe a bit more, maybe 2 to 250, something like that. So there's a couple of examples.
Okay, thanks. And those sort of entry-level roles, presumably salaries might be lower. Is that the case, Amandeep? Do you find that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I have this sort of debate with clinical people all the time, and just saying you kind of have to set your expectations a little bit lower. I think we are actually paid pretty well compared to some other sectors when we're doing clinical work. And what happens is that most other sectors probably don't always have the visibility of what doctors are paid. So they have in their mind what they think that, you know, a role like that might cost them. And then when they meet you and you say, this is my salary expectation, they can get a bit of a shock. But my advice is that, and I've said this in previous webinars for people who've heard me speak, is that sometimes you do have to take that step back to move forward. And it doesn't take long, because then once you have that unique experience and skill set, you'll get back up to where you were before long. So I think if you have the opportunity, like from a lifestyle perspective, to take a bit of a pay cut to try something new, I would absolutely, you know, advise you to do that, because it's temporary and you always have your clinical career to fall back on. And the other thing you can do with some negotiations is actually decrease the time. So if somebody says my budget is X and I want you 4 days a week, and you say, well, I actually cost, you know, Y, and they go, well, that we're not matching here. What you can say to them is, how about you have me 2 days a week, and I'm going to work really hard, and then you can supplement your income the other days with your clinical work. And then when they realize the value that you bring, you can have that negotiation down the track if you need to bring the, you know, pay rate up. So it's always a conversation. It's not like in public hospital settings where there's an award and you can't negotiate. I think with a lot of organisations you can negotiate, and you can negotiate not just on the salary, you can negotiate on the conditions, and you can say, you know, as Wayne had mentioned before, you know, can I get some equity in the company? You know, is there options available? You know, is there an ability for you to pay for me to do these courses? You know, so look at things outside of sort of the monetary value as well. So that would be my advice.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question here referencing coaching and wanting to know how it can help and where to find more about it. And I think the coaching journey is an interesting one, because the role of a coach is not to necessarily tell you what you should be doing, but to try and uncover what your interests are, and also to try and help you identify what skills and expertise you have that could translate into the corporate world or into a divergent career. And certainly we know of several coaches that work in this space, and Amandeep, whether it's somebody like Ash Coxon that works in this space, or there are others that we potentially could put you in touch with.
Yeah, and I think we had Sarah Dalton on the call earlier, who's an expert in this space as well. So I mean, I wish I could get her to come and talk a bit about her coaching experience. But there's certainly clinicians who have ventured into this area, and whether it's coaching, from a patient perspective and coaching patients, or whether it's coaching other peers. So there's lots of different applications of coaching, but I do think that that's a skill set that doctors have generally and can certainly build on. And I think there was lots of formal education processes that you can go through to sort of, upskill in that area. But yeah, I mean, if you reach out to one of us, I'm sure we can connect you with somebody who has done a lot of coaching in that space, and certainly you can create a career around it.
Okay, thanks. I have another question here about Chris, who loves coding, programming and its challenges, and many ideas, but little exposure to actual work. Do part-time roles exist in this field? Amandeep,
answer that. Yeah, I mean, look, definitely. My advice again is just to get your foot in the door, is to contact companies that you would love to work for. And often that's how I found people in your sort of area have gotten into the industry, is, I absolutely love your product. I've been looking at it, if any work comes up, or can I come and do some sort of, work experience, come hang out with you. Certainly that has been an avenue. And then when the organisation sees your enthusiasm and interest, rather than going out to the market, they can certainly look at opportunities to hire you. So I'd certainly just be reaching out, not waiting for job ads, because nobody puts up job ads saying, I need a doctor who's also a programmer or a coder. Doesn't really happen very often. So I think, be proactive and reach out. And I actually have had people in the Creative Careers in Medicine group who have got jobs that way, by reaching out to their favourite, software technology vendor, and have been subsequently offered roles. So yeah, that's how I'd suggest approaching it.
Okay, thanks. We've probably got time just for one more, we have there've been a couple of questions, I think, about part-time roles and at what point it becomes feasible to balance that part-time with a clinical career, and also what the opportunities are, I guess, for part-time. Do you have a view on that, Amandeep, in terms of what point in your career it's appropriate to start looking at opportunities outside of traditional clinical ones?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think any time really. I think, we're constantly faced with this dilemma from some of the people in the CCIM community about, whether they get a fellowship, whether they, finish internship if they've got interests outside of clinical medicine. And I have to say, there's no one size fits all. There's no answer. I can't say, okay, you don't need a fellowship, pursue your interests beforehand and then don't worry about the fellowship. Because some people it is important, and for others it's not important because of what they want to do. So I think it's a very individual decision, but there is no right answer, and there are lots of people who've been successful who haven't spent a lot of years in a clinical setting, and there are people who haven't because they needed more clinical exposure. So I don't know that I can answer that easily, but I have to say that it's a good idea to get clinical exposure if it suits you and fits in with what you want to do. The more you have of it, the more it gives you things that you can sort of draw back on if you are going non-clinical. But always good if you can manage a mix for a while, as long as you can, because then it does give you exposure to both worlds and makes you attractive to some of those employers in non-clinical roles because they like people who've had recent clinical experience. So I do feel that if you can manage it, do it. But if you really are miserable, don't force yourself.
And I just perhaps add quickly to that, if people are looking to go into leadership roles in healthcare management, medical leadership, become a department head or a stream director or something like that, then you do need to, the characteristics you'll need there apart from clinical work. So typically even those jobs, a clinical director in a hospital, they're going to work 2 or 3 days a week in their normal clinical role. They're going to spend a couple of days a week doing other things, and so you need to be able to sort of manage stakeholders, deal with organisational politics, have very good EQ. I mean, the more you go, the higher you go in leadership. I think it's probably a case of whatever level you are in leadership, actually, you have to have really good interpersonal skills, the ability to solve problems, manage people, some of which you'll intrinsically have those skills from having a clinical background, but, managing a budget, managing performance, you may not have had to do much of that. So I think wherever you can get that opportunity, I'd encourage you to do that. And, it's not just in the healthcare setting where you work, but it could be with, the AMA or a college and the various committees they have. So the more you do that, the more you can demonstrate leadership, then, the more equipped you'll be to get one of those jobs that you might want.
Okay, thanks, Wayne. Now, I know we've just gone over the hour, and I know that Amandeep has to dash off. So I think with all of the questions that we've not been able to get to so far, we will actually respond to you individually, just to make sure that you get the answers that you need. So I'd just like to thank Amandeep very much for her input this evening, and also thank Wayne for his input, and thank everyone for attending and for participating. I hope you found it useful and informative. And if we just pop to the next slide, I'll just a few contact details there in terms of who you can contact. So for those of you that might be interested in a divergent or creative career, then please contact Carol, and her email is there on the screen. And of course, Amandeep's CCAM community is a great place to connect with like-minded individuals and explore what options might be open to you. After this webinar, we'll be sending out an email to all attendees, and in that link, in that email, there'll be a link to your exclusive copy of our white paper, which I hope you find to be a good read. Thanks very much again, and hope you all have a good evening. Good night.
Claire, thanks, Wayne.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everyone.